A Huguenot is a member of a French Protestant denomination with origins in the 16th or 17th centuries. Historically, Huguenots were French Protestants inspired by the writings of John Calvin in the 1530s, who became known by that originally derisive designation by the end of the 16th century. The majority of Huguenots endorsed the Reformed tradition of Protestantism. Huguenot numbers peaked near an estimated 2 million by 1562, concentrated mainly in the southern and central parts of France, about 1/8 the number of French Catholics. As Huguenots gained influence and more openly displayed their faith, Catholic hostility grew. In spite of increasingly liberal political concessions and edicts of toleration from the French crown, a series of religious conflicts followed, known as the Wars of Religion, fought intermittently from 1562 to 1598. The wars finally ended with the granting of the Edict of Nantes, which granted the Huguenots substantial religious, political and military autonomy. Renewed religious warfare in the 1620s caused the political and military privileges of the Huguenots to be abolished following their defeat. They retained the religious provisions of the Edict of Nantes until the rule of Louis XIV, who progressively increased persecution of them until he issued the Edict of Fontainebleau, which abolished all legal recognition of Protestantism in France, and forced the Huguenots to convert. While nearly three-quarters eventually were killed or submitted, roughly 500,000 Huguenots had fled France by the early 18th century. The bulk of Huguenot émigrés relocated to Protestant European nations such as England, Wales, Scotland, Denmark, Sweden, Switzerland, the Dutch Republic, the Electorate of Brandenburg and Electorate of the Palatinate in the Holy Roman Empire, the Duchy of Prussia, the Channel Islands, and Ireland. They also spread beyond the Old World to the Dutch Cape Colony in South Africa, the Dutch East Indies, the Caribbean, and several of the English colonies of North America, where they were accepted and allowed to worship freely. Persecution of Protestants diminished in France after the death of Louis XIV in 1715, and officially ended with the Edict of Versailles, commonly called the Edict of Tolerance, signed by Louis XVI in 1787. 2 years later, with the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen of 1789, Protestants gained equal rights as citizens. Today, most Huguenots have been assimilated into various societies and cultures, but remnant communities in Alsace and the Cevennes in France and a diaspora of Huguenots in England and French Australians still retain their Huguenot religious tradition. Etymology: a term used originally in derision, Huguenot has unclear origins. Various hypotheses have been promoted. The nickname may have been a combined reference to the Swiss politician Besançon Hugues and the religiously conflicted nature of Swiss republicanism in his time, using a clever derogatory pun on the name Hugues by way of the Dutch word Huisgenoten, referring to the connotations of a somewhat related word in German Huguenot. Geneva was John Calvin's adopted home and the center of the Calvinist movement. In Geneva, Hugues, though Catholic, was a leader of the Confederate Party, so called because it favored independence from the Duke of Savoy through an alliance between the city-state of Geneva and the Swiss Confederation. The label Huguenot was purportedly first applied in France to those conspirators involved in the Amboise plot of 1560. A foiled attempt to wrest power in France from the influential House of Guise. The move would have had the side effect of fostering relations with the Swiss. Thus, Hugues plus Huguenot by way of Huisgenoten supposedly became Huguenot, a nickname associating the Protestant cause with politics unpopular in France. A version of this complex hypothesis is promoted by Oya Roche, who writes in his book, The Days of the Upright, A History of the Huguenots, that Huguenot is a combination of a Dutch and a German word. In the Dutch-speaking north of France, Bible students who gathered in each other's houses to study secretly were called Huguenots, while on the Swiss and German borders they were termed Eidgenossen, or oath fellows, that is, persons bound to each other by an oath. Gallicized into Huguenot, often used deprecatingly, the word became, during 2.5 centuries of terror and triumph, a badge of enduring honor and courage. Some disagree with such double or triple non-French linguistic origins, arguing that for the word to have spread into common use in France, it must have originated in the French language. The Hugues hypothesis argues that the name was derived by association with Hugues Capet, King of France, who reigned long before the Reformation. He was regarded by the Gallicans and Protestants as a nobleman who respected people's dignity and lives. Janet Gray and other supporters of the hypothesis suggest that the name Huguenot would be roughly equivalent to Little Hugos, or those who want Hugo. In this last connection, the name could suggest the derogatory inference of superstitious worship. Popular fancy held that Hugues, the gate of King Hugo, was haunted by the ghost of Le Roi Hugues and other spirits, who instead of being in purgatory came back to harm the living at night. It was in this place in Tours that the Prétendus Réformes habitually gathered at night, both for political purposes, and for prayer and singing psalms. Such explanations have been traced to the contemporary Araguier de la Plancha, who in de l'Estat de France offered the following account as to the origin of the name, as cited by the Cape Monthly. The origin of the name is curious. It is not from the German Eidgenossen as has been supposed. Reguier de la Plancha accounts for it as follows. The name Huguenot was given to those of the religion during the affair of Amboise, and they were to retail it ever since. I'll say a word about it to settle the doubts of those who have strayed in seeking its origin. The superstition of our ancestors, to within 20 or 30 years thereabouts, was such that in almost all the towns in the kingdom they had a notion that certain spirits underwent their purgatory in this world after death, and that they went about the town at night, striking and outraging many people whom they found in the streets. But the light of the gospel has made them vanish, and teaches us that these spirits were street strollers and ruffians. In Paris the spirit was called Le Moine Bourré, at Orleans, Le Mullet Odette, at Blois Le Loup Garin, at Tours, Le Roi Hugues, and so on in other places. Now, it happens that those whom they called Lutherans were at that time so narrowly watched during the day that they were forced to wait till night to assemble, for the purpose of praying God, for preaching and receiving the Holy Sacrament, so that although they did not frighten nor hurt anybody, the priests, through mockery, made him the successors of those spirits which roam the night, and thus that name being quite common in the mouth of the populace, to designate the evangelical Huguenots in the country of Touraine and Amboise. It became in vogue after that enterprise. Some have suggested the name was derived, with similar intended scorn, from les Guenons de Hus,